Bot that's going to tell you it's recording. And we're going to get started. So I have been like, this has been like Christmas morning for me, like as a kid. Like I've been anticipating this day for about a week. So excited to hear from Conrad Wolfram. And I want to tell you a little bit about his background. He's the current CEO of Wolfram Research Europe. And for the past 30 years, he's helped the world to see the potentials of what could be, particularly with mathematics education. And I want to share a couple of personal stories with you about how he's been influential on my life and shaped my, well, in a lot of aspects, my whole thoughts about mathematics and what mathematics could be. I think it was about 15 years ago, somebody told me, and if you know me, if I get told to do something, I don't like to do it. Somebody told me that I should watch this TEDx talk. And they described it as it's radical. And don't be offended, just try to listen. And I remember thinking, how radical could a TEDx talk be about mathematics? I'll give it a go. I finally eventually acquiesced and listened to the TEDx talk. And my mind, I was left like just reeling for weeks, thinking about the message that he presented in that talk and thinking about the potential that we had to change what math could be for lots of children in the world. And there are very few people in the world that can push me to think like get me on the edge of my understanding, which is where I like to be a lot. Conrad successfully did that with his TEDx talk. And then fast forward a few years later, I was at the bookstore and came across this book. And it was one of those books where I thought, oh, yes, I'm always buying math books. Yes, I'll buy it. This one I stayed up late into the night, read the whole thing in one sitting, and I was again left inspired. This book helped me think outside of the system that I live in, that I thrive in, that my kids go to school in, and really helped me to think, what if we changed mathematics so that we had more emphasis on that conceptual understanding portion rather than the procedural progression of skills? And again, I was just left dumbfounded because I was pushed to think outside of this box, which I usually think I do really well, but I was pushed to think even further outside of the box than I currently live in, and was so inspired to use the power that I had in my control to change things for the good for kids. And so I'm just absolutely honored to introduce you to a man who I have looked up to for decades, and I'm so excited to hear his message because I know I'm going to have many sleepless nights again thinking about the message that he shared with me. And so I hope you will join me in welcoming Conrad Wolfram.
That's a super kind introduction, Lindsay. Thanks very much indeed. I hope I can live up to the billing, so to speak. It's not one of these movies where you go to the movie and it wasn't quite what you hope. Anyway, let me see what I can do. I'm going to go pretty quick through a lot, and I hope we're then going to have some chance for questions and discussion afterwards, which I very much welcome. So I've entitled to what maths could be. Because I'm on this side of the pond, we add the s rather than remove it, like you guys do if you're from the US or Canada. And I want to introduce the word computation and math, and we're going to talk a little bit about the interchangeable nature. So what I want to talk about is what could math be when we reimagine it, given modern technology, given the age we're entering. That's really what I want to talk about. I want to do pretty deep dive on that. And I'm going to ask some pretty existential questions that may offend as well. Do we need math now we have computers and AI? Some of the recent discussions about AI, people say, well, maybe you don't need abstract math anymore. It's kind of like it'll all be sort of statistically figured out, and we don't really need to think this way anymore. I reject that, by the way. But I do want to ask those sorts of questions as well. And therefore, how does that fit? The overall thing I want us to think about is, in the real world has changed, is changing fast, probably at the fastest rate it ever has. And it's changing in ways that seem to impinge quintessentially on what humans were known for, intelligence. How should education react to this? That's the sort of underlying theme I want to have, because we really need to understand that deeply in order to do a good job. And, you know, it's very difficult to see when you're in a rapidly changing environment what it looks like, so to speak, with history or, you know, etc. So I think that's something that's quite hard to do, and the sort of underlying some of the thinking we've been involved in. So world's changing in lots of ways, but the key way I want to talk about is what I call ubiquitous computation. So we're all sitting here. Anybody in any, you know, in a developed country at this point certainly has multiple computing device, massive computing power available to them every minute, every second of the day. And that is a huge change. So, you know, we've got smartphones, we've got the cloud, we've got computers, you've got it literally wherever you are, whenever you are, in some form. And that huge new machine, if you like, is brand new to the world in the last few decades. And its particularly ubiquitous nature is really quite recent. And I want to make clear that I counter that as the underlying sort of capability that has enabled AI, which is sort of the, in a sense, an application of computation. So that's kind of where we are. And I won't discuss in great detail on this talk, but one of the parallels I see is the rise of electricity in the 19th century. And I think it's possibly as a bigger change, the rise of computation. But it's a sort of think pre-electricity, and then think when you look, electricity was sort of available to everything in all things. And we're still developing, we're still building new applications, like electric cars are relatively new on the scene in practical terms. So look, my day job, as many of you will know, is to sort of try and build the best computation system. So for many years, we've been building technology to try and sort of build an underlying framework for all of computation, build one language that represents everything, and where we can do sort of higher level math as well as sort of more ubiquitous level of computations and things. And originally, we were knowing from Mathematica, and more recently, Wolfram Alpha. I say more recently, it's actually 2009 it was launched in, but I count that as a symbolic AI, if you're using modern terminology. And actually, I need to adjust this shortly because we will soon be 36 years old. We were born on June the 23rd, which we subsequently discovered when we had Wolfram Alpha was Alan Turing's birthday, but we didn't know that at the time. And Steve Jobs was at the launch event for Mathematica, and we've been building things ever since. And one of the interesting parts of watching the last 36 years is how mathematics felt much more specialized, and now feels much more of a general purpose tool that the whole of society uses. And that's a theme I want to come back to. So let's discuss for a moment where we were at the end of 2022, roughly speaking. And I like these to talk about this in three columns. So there are high-level computation was everywhere. It's already everywhere by the end of 2022. And there are subjects where it's sort of always been, like mathematics itself is kind of, in a sense, you know, is computation. It depends how you define the words. Physics, for many hundreds of years, has been, you know, a central driver and user of computation. And there are things like accounting, which, you know, going hundreds of years back was a key user of mathematics, of course. Then there are these areas that are very newly conceived, you know, programming, data science, social media, many areas of finance, and of course AI. These are things that didn't really exist before sort of high-level computation. They're kind of a product of that. And then this is third column, which people often forget, which is subjects that have existed for a long time, but now have a computational version of them. So computational, you know, biology, computational history, computational medicine, computational sports. These are all, if you go to certain universities, these are all starting to be quite well-known areas. It's kind of like there's a whole way of thinking about biology that's computational biology. It doesn't mean that you don't think about it the traditional way, but you add computation. It's an extra layer. And that third column is absolutely critical to the way the world has progressed in the last 35 years and so forth. So virtually every area, a bit like I mentioned about electricity, virtually every area now you can deploy computation and get a different, potentially better set of answers than you could have done without. And that needs to tell us something about our educational setup. So a little example I like to show here. If I go and try and type some base pairs into this, and I'm going to just try and ask, where does that sequence exist in the human genome? And I'm going to try and do this live. And I know oh gosh, that's unusual. I picked a sequence that just has one place in the human genome where that sequence is. That was luck more than anything. But if you think about it, this is amazing. I think it was in the Clinton era where the whole human genome sequencing project started, not that long ago. And people were wondering whether it would get done in a lifetime. Now, on my computer in front of you, I can search the whole thing, pull out, a particular site of a sequence, and figure out it's in chromosome 9, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, in a sense, a little tiny piece of computational biology right there at amazing transformation in the last few years. So I suppose my message is this computer-based maths, I should probably knock the S off for this audience, has come of age in a way that math never had done before computers. So we are in an absolutely golden era for math in many respects. But I'm going to also say that I think the terminology of math is somewhat out, and we need to understand both the terminology and the reality of what we're talking about. So I'm going to use this word computation, which I think is slightly less polarizing, because I don't want to, so to speak, infect the discussion with the exact brands that we put on what we're talking about. But to my mind, there's this area computation, this very deliberate way of working things out with this process we'll talk about, which is absolutely critical to humankind at this point, and is the major thing that's driven us forward in the last few decades and promises to in the future. Now, I talked about what happened to the end of 2022. Let's talk about 2023 and the arrival of generative AI en masse. What does this do? I think what this is doing is not only computation is available to everyone, but is sort of accessible to everyone and potentially in all fields. So that's another step up from sort of where we were in 2022. There have been various steps up over the years from, you had a computer on your desk to the fact that it was more usable. And in a sense, the way to think about this, I think, is sort of ChatGPT and LLMs in general, a sort of major bridge between, in a sense, the computational and the human world, if I can put it that way. It's a new way to cross between those. Not the only way, but a new way that's powerful. So education must reflect this changed and changing real world. So what does that mean? I think it means a few things. Firstly, we need as much as possible to replicate the real outside world subject in our educational subject. We need to evolve that as rapidly as possible so that it is up to date with what we're really doing. And another part of that is to use modern machinery. One of the great things about this industrial revolution is the machinery we use in real world for doing these things, computers, you can immediately take into the classroom, right? This was not true, when we were talking about smelting plants in the Industrial Revolution, right? You couldn't just take the smelting plant, put it in the classroom. It didn't work like that. This is so that we actually have a unique ability this time to replicate real life in the classroom and to use modern machinery. And the other thing I would add here is, modern machinery, the more modern and user-friendly the machinery, the easier it is for beginners. So don't start with the stuff that's hardest to use. It's a very critical idea, in my view, don't start with a classic car if somebody's learning to drive. It's kind of better to start with a modern car, which is easier to drive first, even if you then want to go into a more difficult to operate machine. And the other key question, possibly for what we have to consider is, how do we optimize human involvement in all this? What is the human role in this new age? What is it that humans add value to? What do we do? Now, when we discuss AI, computation, education, computers, there's a big confusion in almost every conference and things I go to. People love to talk about the second one of these, the pedagogy. They say, oh, it's great. I like to deploy computers on math, and it's great. I can train somebody to do a quadratic equation by hand by having a computer help them. I was like, hang on just a moment. Let's talk about the first thing first, which is, what is it we're supposed to be learning? Let's talk about that before we talk about how we learn it. And we need to at least keep these very separate in our heads. Of course, they intertwine. The way you learn is related to what you're learning. But let's get clear on what it is we're learning. And that's what I want to spend most of this talk on. Now, my view of this, I want to sort of essentially go down two tracks in parallel a little bit here. This is, you guys are mostly math people in one form or another. And I want to talk very much, obviously, about math. But I want to remind you that math is very central, really, for a couple of reasons. It's, in my view, critical in its own right. But I think now we've got this AI age that's upon us. It is also emblematic of the challenges facing all subjects. Math has been, in my view, out of alignment for some time. But all subjects, there's going to be a change in the real world on how you do history, how you do, biology, et cetera, et cetera. These are all changing. And we better learn the lessons from math, which is sort of ahead of the game in, real world divergence, as we'll talk about, for these other subjects before that hits us too. So focus on math, but realize this actually pertains to all subjects potentially in some level. So why do I say math is at the epicenter? Well, most jurisdictions consider it critical, probably the most critical subject as school subjects go anyway for what I would call the AI age that we're entering. It's also very quantifiably accessible, which is not necessarily good in some ways. It means that people put a lot of, if you get, 82% in your math, they think that's very reproducible, very much grades what you've done. It gives you a real standing on what it is. And perhaps more so than subjects where you kind of have to mark an essay or something like that, and it's more perhaps amenable to differences of view. Obviously, there are a huge number of learning hours and money and everything else associated with math. There are a huge number of students doing it. But yet, in my view, it is more divergent of mainstream subjects from real-world requirements than virtually any other mainstream subject. And that's what I'm going to come on to describe. My view of math is that it's done an absolutely terrible job of adapting to the real world at a time when it is the leading thing, the leading, in a sense, human intellectual endeavor that's driving the world. So it's kind of more critical than ever, but yet it's done a worse job at adapting. And actually, the two are somewhat linked. Just want to go back to that release of Mathematica in 1988 with Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs came up with this fantastic quote. Mathematica will revolutionize the teaching and learning of math by focusing on the prose of mathematics without getting lost in the grammar. Very Jobsian kind of quote. Very neat. The problem is, the reason I've highlighted will is because we're still waiting. And, we're many years on, right? Decades on. And this really hasn't quite happened. And that's, when I found this quote, it was after I worked a lot on computer-based math, I refound this. It was very interesting how this sort of triggered the sort of thing we're thinking about here. So let's zoom out a moment and ask the question, what is the reason why we all learn math? What is the underlying thing? Why is it compulsory for virtually every jurisdiction around the world for years of our life? Can we justify that? Well, I think we can if it's the right math. And I guess the way I look at math is it's one of the best systems for making decisions that we have, that humans have ever derived. We can talk about it in English and we can decide some things, and that's great. We can compute fantastic numbers of things, whether we're building engineering projects or finance, sometimes well, sometimes badly, or nowadays doing all sorts of things with AI. These are all facets of computing results, the idea of abstracting things and the whole process of mathematics that really allows that very precise answer in a way that just discussing it in human language does not typically. So I think there's an absolutely central reason for mathematics, which is better decisions. And at all levels, how one runs one's life, how one does one's job better, how society collectively makes decisions, and so forth. And I would categorize this sort of at two ends of the spectrum. I think there's a sort of core human skill, which I would sort of take from, at the top end, computational thinking. Our top computational thinkers need to really add value. They're the calligraphers. If you're talking about, writing or something, they're the calligraphy end of the spectrum. They're the people who are really adding value in a sense. And, there aren't too many of those people, but they're the ones who are designing the new systems and so forth. But for the whole of society, we need a computational literacy. We need an ability for people to function, understand how these decisions are being made, be able to fit with those. And I think this is very parallel, so I'll come back to literacy and the rise of reading and writing. We're in a sort of era where we need to be able to do this. And for example, the pandemic was a great example of this. I think if you'd had the pandemic 50 years before, the discourse publicly would have been far less computational than it was, about data and about, percentages and risks and things. And you could see much of our populations couldn't assimilate that really. They couldn't relate to it. And that had all sorts of problems about, how do they make decisions with regard to that. So the problem is, this is the core of what I think we need in our mainstream education. And the place you'd look for all of this is math. But I'm going to argue it isn't really there as much as it should be by a long shot. And so the educational crisis I see around math is that there is no core computational thinking, computational literacy subject. Math ought to be that subject. That's the justification for it as a mainstream subject. But I think by the time you're pre-college, I think it's probably about 80% off base in subject. Not talking about how it's delivered. I'm talking about the actual subject. And here's why. Pretty simple to state. In real-world math, computers do almost all the calculating. That's the fact of the matter and has been for a long time. In educational math, people do almost all the calculating. And there is the 80% problem right there. And, it's to sort of investigate this further, I like to describe math as a 4-step process. In essence, this is what it is. You take a problem, and the problem might be, a typical problem you want to solve in life. And one of the examples I give, if I'm giving a talk in a lecture room, I sometimes say, if we seal down the lecture room, turn off the air conditioning, one of the defining questions might be, how long can you survive if I talk for too long? So that might be a defining question. And then the question is, how do you abstract that to a form? Why do you abstract it? Well, you abstract it because math is this wonderful thing where you take a question like that, or you might take many other kinds of questions, and you can turn it into the same math. And that same math has a system by which you then work out an answer that's quite precise using methodology that's been developed in some cases over hundreds of years. So that's why we abstract. So the problem about air in the room may in fact have the same mathematics as some completely different problem. But we have, let's say, equations to go and work out the answer. And that's very powerful because we've got then systems that zooms it out from discussing air per se. So then step 3 is we take the question in its abstract form, here's an equation, and we turn it in, this magical process of turning it into the answer. So here's the equation, and at the end of step 3, we get x equals 3 or something. And then step 4 is we say x equals 3. Now, what did that mean? 3 hours. We were in hours. Does that mean we have 3 hours to survive, in the scenario I set up? Or is that crazy? Does that not mean if it came out as -3, we probably made a mistake, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So we're interpreting results. We're going from abstract to the real world. And in education, in school, we spend almost all our time doing step 3 by hand. And one of the results of that is that we drown out much. So we should be using step 3, doing most of step 3 on computers almost all the time. They do it much better. And we should be using ourselves, our students, to do much more of steps 1, 2, and 4 on much harder problems, much more complex, conceptual, messy problems. And by the way, with modern AI, I think you can also see how steps 1, 2, and 4 are getting some more help from the computer. So it's not just step 3 anymore, but steps 1, 2, and 4 also benefit potentially from a computer. So another way to look at this is that you're going through these 4 steps, you're going up a kind of helix, and potentially you're going around them many times until you actually get to an answer you think is satisfactorily accurate for what you want. That is the problem-solving process of computational thinking or mathematics, in my view. And just to be clear about a few separations, a very simple example I love to show. Here is a linear simultaneous equation, typical of many, many curricula. which we ask many students to solve by hand. Now, if I go and just put a cube in here, we get a more complicated output. And most students, after many years of study, fail to be able to do this by hand. But yet the actual setup of this is just the same. It's an equation. What we really want to know is, here's a real problem. It turned into a cubic simultaneous equation. And what do I do with this answer? How can I use this answer to get back to answering my question? That's the point. The fact that they can't even do this and they aren't allowed to do this after many years of study is a shame. And by the way, much harder equation than this, and many more tool sets. So that's the sort of difference between knowing the concept of equations, in a sense, and knowing how you happen to solve a particular kind of equation. So when you look at the headings in traditional math curriculum, you see things like, calculating long division, completing the square, surds, which I particularly hated, etc., the chain rule. What I'm talking about is contextual problems where you use the whole process in real life. What's the perfect password for your login, right? Problem of most, 6 or 7-year-olds don't want their friends to break into things, right? If I have a game I want to play, how many controls do I need for it? Are they orthogonal, etc.? Much later on, should I insure my laptop or not? Is it worth insuring it? Also things that are, potentially, what's a beautiful shape? A problem, Athenian architects thought about many thousands of years ago in a mathematical form, right? These are all mathematical problems, but they don't look like our current curricula very much. Key point, if you remove the computer from computation in the curriculum, I don't mean just delivering it, but the subject. If you remove it, you will remove almost all the context of modern mathematics. So here's why. And people don't like me saying this, but mathematics wasn't all that useful for much of life before computers, right? It was good for physics, some bits of it. Or my brother would argue that there are many more bits that it would have been, can deliver better with computers. It was, good for accountancy and various other things. It was lousy for things with lots of data. Biology didn't really hit. Pretty lame on medicine, etc., right? Computers have enabled mathematics to go way beyond the context that it existed in before and produce useful answers. And that's continuing, of course, apace right now. So if you remove the machine that allowed it to go to all those contexts in the real world, you will remove most of the context in education. And we see this. We have toy problems in our education. Why? Because most of the problems that you actually want to solve in real life, you can't do without a computer. It's just not what math is doing. And you, by the way, end up also with a worse problem, which is you end up using the wrong tool set. So if you're going to attempt to solve a real life problem today, one of the tool sets you might consider is machine learning. Where's that in our math curricula? Haven't seen it in most of them. Right, didn't make it in yet, even though much of the world is thinking about machine learning and solve problems. It doesn't make, you don't see many other of the thousands of tool sets we have in, for example, Mathematica. So what does that mean? It's actually very damaging. It means that we're telling our students to work with a very small set of tools that are not probably what they'd use in real life, and end up potentially literally learning the wrong subject in some cases. And it's a more complicated argument I have time for here, but fundamentally, if you look at the 4 steps I talked about, step 3 is now very cheap. Step 3 was, in a sense, the most expensive step of the 4-step process. So much of the whole of mathematics for hundreds of years was, how can we make step 3 as simple as possible so we can actually use mathematics to do anything? Actually, if you want a fun story, one of my teachers at school was a friend of Alan Turing's, the inventor of computers. Had been a professor at Cambridge and then turned into a school teacher, a rather eccentric fellow. I rather liked him. Anyway, he had a saying, which was, maths is the art of avoiding calculation. And he was right. At the time, he was right. That's exactly what it was. And now it isn't. It's been turned 100% on its head. right? It's now, we can calculate very, very cheaply. We have fantastic machines there, machines that have overtaken that beyond any human imagination. You know, probably the most successful machinery ever in human history. So therefore, these other steps become much more important in terms of the cost. And we do things very differently. So for example, when you're abstracting, you might now abstract to many things at once. You might try lots of different methods at the same time. You just throw them into the computer, see how they compare, see what the result comes out. But that's not what we teach students. And I wrote a rather caustic piece against the British government in the early stage of the pandemic, when they got rid of exam testing because of the pandemic, and they tried to simulate the grades they thought students would get. And they made a complete botch of it. Couldn't have made a worse botch of it. Why? Because most of the people in the Department for Education were thinking along the lines they were trained in mathematics. So they threw out most of the data. They tried to simplify it all and fit distributions to it, which basically ended up with pretty idiotic results, which they then had to abandon. So completely the wrong thinking. So as I said in the blog post, they'd been hoisted by their own petard of the wrong mathematics, and had faced the consequence, or rather the students did. One key point in all this: don't confuse what I call the mechanics of the moment with the essence of the subject. So to my mind, the essence of mathematics is this problem-solving subject that's so powerful. Now, the mechanics of the moment for hundreds of years was by hand, this very deliberate abstracting, and that's what you focused on, as I explained. But that mechanics changed onto its head, and that's not the point. The point is the solving using the system, and the question is how we best do that. And we might have some debate about that later, but that is my belief about mainstream mathematics. Yeah, if you get excited about the mechanics inside because you are a specialist in mathematics, wanting to do that, that's wonderful. I'm very supportive of that. But that isn't what we need everyone doing. And it probably isn't, by the way, how we get the largest number of people being excited about mathematics itself either. So, key point: better deployment of the wrong subject won't fix the problem, right? However well we teach or learn the wrong subject, you aren't going to get to the right subject. You can impinge on it, but you can't get to the right subject. And I think that's something many jurisdictions haven't quite understood, and is a real problem around the world. And it's, by the way, causing a lot of disquiet, upset. People don't think they can do this subject, but actually some of the subject they're being asked to do, they don't need to be able to do right now. Little example, this is a thing we sometimes try in classrooms. We take half the students and say, take a coin and toss it 200 times and note down the results. And let's take the other half and cheat. Tell them just to type in heads and tails and cheat, like I'm doing right here. And send the results to the teacher. And with a little bit of analysis, the question is, can the teacher tell who's cheated or not? So I think you can tell here, we failed most of the tests. So I'm pretty sure that I cheated, so to speak. And the amazing thing is, if you actually do the experiment, it usually comes, now I'm going to be a smart student, I hope, and I'm going to semi-cheat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a little program, and I'm going to try and use the program to write a better simulation I could do by hand to see whether I can fool it and, so to speak, fool the teacher into believing that I've actually done the experiment when I haven't bothered. So I'm going to take this and paste it in here. This is the result. And it'll accept this input, I think. In fact, that passed all 5 tests. So I'm pleased to say mathematics is a good random number generator, et cetera, et cetera. And the students are amazed by this. It's like, how did you tell? What did I do wrong? Right? Well, this is a modern, this is typical modern maths, right? This is looking at patterns in data, and some of them come up with maybe it's to do with the patterns that you're looking at. Turns out most people type too evenly, and you can tell that. And so you tend not to be random enough in the way you type when you type by hand and do things like this. It's not like the actual thing, and you can tell that. So this is sort of an early track into how you do credit card fraud detection, for example. This is typical sort of real mathematics, but you can't do this if you don't have a computer. It just isn't the sort of thing you can do. And it's a different way of thinking than you would think in traditional non-computer mathematics. So, as Lindsay kindly mentioned at the beginning, we've since 2010 or so been starting to build out, trying to understand the structure and what we would do to build a core computational curriculum that assumes computers exist. And I mean, the extraordinary thing to me is no jurisdiction in the world. I've looked pretty hard And I can't see at the moment anyone who's really been trying to do this except us. You'd think it was pretty obvious, right? New machine came there. We're trying to figure out, given the machine, how does the subject change? But that isn't really what's happened. And there are a number of reasons why not. But anyway, that is what we've been trying to do. It's not easy because all of us who know something about mathematics were obviously trained traditionally. And it's quite hard to figure out what you need to know as a human now that you have these machines and what you don't need to know, and you can go further and faster. So here's what we're trying to actually deliver in reality. Sort of actual student learning materials, I think, is central to this, because you want to know where are you going and how would you actually solve a problem in real life. That's the sort of way to get to it. And we want to sort of direct students to modern outcomes. And, you've got to tether assessments that test the right things, not the wrong things. And also, the way curricula are written at the moment is pretty unhelpful to, I think, moving subjects forward. And we also need curricular specking that works for AI personas in future as well as humans, so we can have AIs helping to teach. And we've also been building recently AI tutoring and assessment, which actually is working remarkably well to help in delivering sort of these new sort of subject areas. So very, very simple example of a typical module, if I can find it here. This was a module built for the Irish, actually, on how fast could I cycle how fast can I cycle? Can we learn how to cycle faster around a race like the Tour de France is the French equivalent? I forget what the Irish one was called. And this is a very scaffolded module. We've got very scaffolded things. We've got projects, and obviously where we want to end up is people start with whatever technology they want. They have a problem and they know how to work with those to get the best answer. And so, I'm not going to go through all of this, but we want to address in this things like, what is a model in mathematics, and how do you use a model, and how does it relate? What is a model? Many adults have no idea about this. People running banks don't really understand what models are and when they can trust them and can't trust them, this sort of thing. So this is a model of a cyclist, and don't worry about how it's built for the moment, but worry about how to examine it. This is a typical thing you need to do in real life. You've got a complex model. Do I believe the model? Don't I? Can I understand what it does? Incidentally, this is the teacher version, so it has orange boxes that represent what help for teachers. There's a student version that doesn't have these. So we built this because we realized that delivering a new subject, teachers aren't familiar with the subject, right? Because it's not the subject they study exactly. Anyway, this is sort of early stage of the modeling. There are various questions here that you can ask to try and get the student thinking about what they're trying to understand with this. And much later here, we do things like, what makes a big difference how fast you can cycle? Is it, rolling resistance of the tire, or is it, your frontal area and things, and your aerodynamic resistance and so forth? So quite hard stuff, for the average 15 or 16-year-old. This is pretty hard by traditional standards. Messy, it's hard, doesn't work exactly as you like it to. Stuff that they'll actually face, load in real equations, get them used to dealing with messy situations, etc. And then we've got, sort of extension activities, which are more project with less scaffolding, and which come in different places. So that's sort of a rough layout. I'm just showing the teacher edition at the moment, and sort of an idea of how you might do scaffold. These sort of projects are more of the open-ended things. How can you model hurricanes? Something which was done, actually, I think, in Texas years ago by a very keen Wolfram user in front of the Senate hearing or whatever it was in Texas, if I've got that right. Anyway, so these are real things. This is what you do with the humans, what you do with the computer. Get people used to doing hard projects and how you would deal with that, because that's partly what needs to be learned. And a key part of this is sort of the outcomes. What are the outcomes we're trying to hit? And I think these are much too narrow in traditional math curricula. So we've come up with sort of 11-dimensional tree, if you like. Again, I won't go through all of these, but confidence to tackle new problems. If you leave your math education without any confidence to tackle new problems, that doesn't leave you very well equipped. And there are real things you can do to help this, right? It's not just sort of ethereal. There are real pieces of help you can give students, to give them confidence, in my view. Critiquing and verifying, very important. Communicating and collaborating, also very important. I mean, it's what we do in life. And one of the ones I insisted we had to have was how you manage computation. When you manage a company like I do, you read the management book, which mostly I haven't. it doesn't tell you very accurately what to do. It's like you read the management book, but then the people don't work as they told you they would in the management book exactly. It's not how it works. You need experience of what actually happens on the ground. Same in math, right? You try a real problem, it doesn't work exactly as you hope. The computer goes wrong, code didn't work, you have to debug it, whatever. You need to actually have experience of what happens when you're really doing real calculations. It's got to be built into our education. It's central to actually using what we're learning. So another part of outcomes are very strange is that thinking, in quotes, what do we think of as being thinking in an AI age? And, you know, there are no outcomes in traditional curricula that seem to relate to this. They sort of have thinking as a byproduct of what you're doing. You know, if you solve the quadratic equation by hand, you'll imbue some thinking. Why aren't we explicit about the thinking we actually want to imbue, and then have the things you're doing as a mechanism for imbuing that, not the other way around? And I know Alec, who's also in this call, who I've worked with for many years, has built a sort of trying to build a representation in a sense of the different sort of levels, trying to put everything together here. What are the different steps and levels and sort of rooms and contexts? It's quite a complicated picture that you have here for different sorts of students in different stages that you have to think about in kind of how you model what outcomes are. It's a quite interspersed sort of thing. And we've done a lot of thinking about how to make that work so that one can hit all the outcomes one wants to. Most of the things, I think, like, for example, PISA international tables, I think, are a bit narrow in the way that they connect up outcomes compared to what we think. I didn't mean to do that. So let me go back to my notebook here. Right, sorry. Let me go to the right notebook, and then we'll get to the right place. Right. Right. I think it seemed very. Anyway, that's the screen I wanted to be on. That's what happens at this time of day here. Right. I'm a bit later on than in the day than you guys mostly. Okay, so a very quick summary here. I'm not going to dwell on. If you go through everything I've said, I think you could crystallize out a number of mistakes that have been made over the last decades in math education that we need to correct, not only for math, but for all subjects. So, you know, basics does not mean by hand, in my view. Succeeding does not mean improving assessment results on the wrong assessments or ones that measure the wrong things. You know, fair doesn't mean it's easy to assess, etc., etc., etc. And a crucial one, how to work the machine is not the same as how the machine works. Very critical. As you get more machinery and you get more automation, those two are absolutely not the same thing. So anyway, number of things that I think we've somewhat misunderstood and we need to correct. And if we have time, I'd love to any objections and comments on this. I'm very happy to try and delve into those. So while I was here, I thought I would give you, since Wolfram is very much in the center of the sort of AI computation revolution, I thought I'd give you a quick sort of state of the art of where we are with some of actually improving, particularly the pedagogy of either traditional or non-traditional subjects. So this is a British, or I should say English and Welsh A-level paper, which is what you take just before you go to college in England to get to a good college, hopefully. And we thought we would run one of these through ChatGPT by itself, and then through ChatGPT allied to Wolfram Alpha. And it's quite interesting to see what happened. This is just play this quickly. So a video of some things that happened. It is quite amazing how well it does. Even ChatGPT by itself gets 40-something%. But with Wolfram Alpha, it gets 96%. And then there's a thing called further maths, which you take if you're going to a top university and trying to do something like physics or math. And it got 94% on that. I mean, so to give you an idea, I think A grades will be way below 80%, certainly on that. So, I mean, this is like top of the top. So, yeah, I mean, I've sort of put here game over for maths A-level. It's kind of like, if that's what's happening there, you've got a lot of questions about why that's what we're setting in this way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's where we need to be. What we're doing, by the way, there is Wolfram Alpha is what I would call symbolic AI. People often confuse AI with ChatGPT and generative AI. Generative AI is what I call statistical AI. You're probabilistically trying to predict, you know, what to do next. We do a very different thing of deliberately computing things. And actually, the two together work rather well, I think, in producing answers in all sorts of fields, including education. That's why we're working a lot on these things. And one of the things we've been working on is building tutoring and assessment systems. So this you will recognize as the four-step process. And it's asking the question, what will the population of Doha be in 2100? And as you see here, we're getting the Wolfie AI to push us through as a teacher, a student, trying to work through the four-step problem-solving process on an open-ended problem. And it's doing a pretty good job, actually. It's quite amazing. And this is only the start. So I think the thing here to say is it's actually really exciting. And by the way, in terms of rolling out changed math curricula, this is really helpful. I don't in any way think this goes around teachers, but I think it really helps what can be done and what can be done quickly, and confidence for students and deploying this everywhere and all sorts of things. So, I mean, that's just a glimpse into what's possible. That's sort of very latest sort of tech. And we're building tutoring projects and things with the Schmidt Foundation and others to try and do this. Right, to round out, you know, if we implement this new computational curriculum that I would love to see, a core computational curriculum, what does that achieve? Well, one thing it achieves, I think, is we can reorder what we're doing, at the very least. Why aren't we doing calculus for 10-year-olds? Answer, hard to calculate things. Easy to understand. You know, if I hold my glass up here and we ask a question, I don't know whether people can see this in the, but I'm holding a glass up, it's slightly oddly shaped. It's very easy for most younger students, I think, to understand the idea. You might slice this into little discs and add up the volume of those discs and work out how much water is in the glass. Actually doing that with an integral algebraically is pretty hard, so we leave it very late. But there's this magic function called integrate. We don't need them to know the insides of that to start with. We need them just to know where you'd use it and how to use it, and when you get fooled by it, when it goes wrong. That's what we should be doing. And you can do it much earlier, and you can do real problems that might be exciting to them. Same with machine learning for primary schools, right? There's no reason why we can't use machine learning primary schools. It's kind of how you learn as a young child. So much reordering and change. What else can we achieve? We can achieve, in my view, first-rate human problem solvers. That's what we really need. We don't need third-rate human computers. You know, we need to work up a level from the machines and not compete with the machines where they do very well. Don't compete with machines that do well. You'll lose, and there's no point. So what we really want to do is sort of optimize the human-computer hybrid decision-making process. And critically in that, I think we need to have better enfranchisement across society. Look, I think the problem we've got at the moment is what I call the computational divide. We've got a few people at the top of society who are very good at this stuff. And, you know, for better or, I mean, some of them, you know, some of them are very well intended, some of them are not. But it's not good to have a small echelon that controls so much of what powers the world. We need to change that. And that's what I call the computational divide. And I think we can change it. And the critical thing here is, you know, look back at literacy. I think if you look back to the late 1700s, probably, there was a sort of the rise of the idea of mass literacy. And before that time, you know, there was the idea that you didn't really need, you know, a few priests and aristocrats and people to be able to be literate, a few other people, doctors. The rest of society didn't really need it. They're probably too stupid to manage it. It wasn't possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think that's been proven to be utterly false. I mean, you know, mass literacy, I think, is one of the greatest single achievements of education, you know, that you could point to. And by the way, countries, jurisdictions that did that early, UK is a good example of that, benefited tremendously in the upcoming revolution, the Industrial Revolution that followed. So I think now we are in an era where we need mass computational literacy. You know, you can't hire somebody for jobs soon if they don't have basic understanding of how to deploy computation. And that doesn't mean calculating quadratics by hand. It means these bigger picture things, understanding how you'd use data, what models mean, how to do that, how to do basic things on those. It's a different cut. I think we can do it. I think it's possible, but we do actually need to do it and not try and go down the wrong track. So thanks very much. What I want is computational literacy for all. Can Utah be first, or anybody else, any other state represented here? And yeah, I'd love to take questions and comments. Thanks very much.
Thank you
Hey,
so
this is a sorry, Lindsay. You
Go
know me, I
ahead,
like to
Gerald.
talk.
You go.
So I've been a proponent for years, ever since I saw your website years ago, like Lindsay did. And I'm just curious about basically, in your opinion, Conrad, are other countries in the world embracing your ideas? Are you seeing a lot of barriers? Or because you probably know more than anybody else here about how your actions going, right? So can you
Sure.
report to us how that's going?
Look, it's slow progress. Okay. It's frustrating, honestly. Um, I do think it's moved a long way actually in the last few years. And I do think the AI revolution, if you want to call it that, has made a change. Not actually because directly I mean, as I showed you, there's some things that practically improve things, but actually that's not really the reason. It's because people are suddenly asking, oh, maybe all our subjects are slightly wrong. What are we going to do when the AI takes over all our subjects? And that's suddenly pushed the debate much harder on math. And then I'm coming back and saying, yep, I've been telling you this for years, right, about math. Now you've got the problem for everything. It's very different in different countries, okay? And there's a different sort of method. The central problem in all countries is that math is so important, you can't change it, right? If you think about the statement, math is so central, it's essential to university admissions, to college admissions. And so you got to get good grades in math. So anybody who tries to perturb the exam, the system of getting grades, gets into a lot of trouble. And the trouble manifests itself slightly differently in different places. In the US, I see well familiar to use the sort of math war problem. And, and I wrote a blog post as an outsider about that recently, of just observations from an outsider, so to speak. Take the UK, which is another case of a slightly different problem. The UK is less problematic on the ground. A lot of people would agree, but they're sort of like, oh my God, it's too big a problem to do anything about, so we'll just sort of leave it, and then the government flakes out and doesn't know what to do. So there's a sort of intransigence. And in other countries, there are others. I do think we will start to see some countries, probably not obvious ones, where they just want to do something different. It might be the Middle East, might be Eastern Europe, might be various other places where it's just like there's an energy to make change and there's less baggage associated with making the change. But the central problem is we have a stuck educational ecosystem for all subjects, but math is right at the center of this, where you can't make a change to the subject because it's too assessed, too high stakes, and we got to change that some way. And by the way, one parallel in this, if like late 60s, early 70s, you couldn't start a company easily in most countries. It's like too difficult to get funding, too difficult to do this. The US made a big change. The US was the leading country to say, we're going to unlock this so that startups can start. And the US has been phenomenally successful at this. And now every country wants to say, hey, we're the best place to be a startup. So I think we need to somehow, with a mixture of regulation and the need and stuff that's done on the ground, we need to change this across the world. And the place that does this first successfully will benefit tremendously. So slightly negative, but there is a direction forward, I think, on this.
Okay, if people just jump in.
Yep. Go right ahead,
All
Clarence.
right. So I am the research and implementation manager at the Utah STEM Action Center, and my job is to move fast and break stuff and change policy. And I have been fighting the battle with math for the last 10 years. And this presentation really eloquently puts together answers to questions that I've been trying to figure out for a decade. And the way my brain works, I'm just trying to like arrange things all the time and figure out the shortest path to a solution. And all the stuff that you just said about assessment, all of these things, my interaction with legislators, my interactions with stakeholders that care, they want kids to be measured in some way.
I know.
They care less about what you're actually measuring. They want some sort of bar and some sort of like
Yes.
gate that's in the way to keep the dumb ones out or whatever. And so I'm just contemplating like who do we talk to? Who's the right person to create new assessments? I think your point is absolutely accurate, that like assessments right now are the barrier, and there's a lot of money behind that. There's a lot of lobbyists behind that. That's a whole thing. I'll not get political because I'm not allowed to. But but if I feel like if we can figure out clean ways to assess skills in these areas, adopting them will be a lot easier. So
I agree with you.
how do we do that?
Well,
I'm
I think
not a
there's some
developer.
there's some good news, I think, in amongst this. Okay, I do think AI helps with this. So one of the things we've been experimenting with is getting. I mean, Alec particularly here has been experimenting with. I mean, one of the problems we've got is we want simplistic answers like multiple choice or a number as the answer because you can grade it easily. And everybody says, oh, yep, that was the right grade. Now, the fact that that doesn't match what you actually need to do in the real world, as you say, people don't get so concerned about. They should. But I think now you can potentially have more open-ended questions and answers, which an AI can help to grade pretty accurately. And that allows you then to adjust the content to be more representative of what we actually want to assess. And one of the reasons for that outcomes tree that I was showing you earlier is to try and, our modules, we're trying to tie all the things to that outcomes tree at different levels. And we've been starting to build proto assessments for that. So not job done yet, but I think that you can build within the existing sort of framework. I think you can build some, more or less the existing framework, particularly if you've got computers available. You can build assessments that you could, assign grades to fairly accurately, but they would be more representative. And I think that would help then to drive us to a much better subject. So, and I think AIs are right in the middle of helping that, because they take out, the normal thing is it's just too expensive to grade, have humans check each other grading an essay answer or whatever it is. But you can get an AI to help with that, and you can have some confidence that they've done a decent job at a 3-line textual answer. Then you can start asking those questions that produce those answers. So that's part of it. And we'd love to talk more to you about, that and whether we can implement. I mean, one of the other frustrating things I'm going to add in at this point is, the funds available for all sorts of things around education and math are massive around the world, but not for thinking about what the subject should be or the assessments around it. For new subjects, I mean, assessment fixing for traditional assessments, that has got to change. There has to be an R&D funding budget in different jurisdictions. Otherwise, you're going to lose. I mean, just like, you fund DARPA or whatever, right? It's like you need a mini educational DARPA for new things that you're trying to do in the subject, not just the pedagogy. But the trouble is that the way it's set up, all the money is in trying to get the trying to get the grades better. You can do a massive startup if you can get the pedagogy to get the grades slightly better, but no money if you want to change the subject. So again, that's a sort of ecosystem thing that needs to change. But there are, I think, directions that can help.
Hi, I'm Brynja, and thank you so much, Conrad, for this excellent and inspiring conversation today. I really appreciate the points you've made about this computational divide, and appreciate this conversation about assessment and its complexity. But I wanted to kind of talk about the student ownership of their own creative projects, their own results of this computational thinking cycle. And because I think that way of allowing students to sort of engage in these creative investigations and then create the products is what's most inspiring for them to stay in STEM and learn more. But that job of active student engagement is difficult.
It's very difficult.
I wanted to also say that your work reminds me of Mitch Resnick's work and his beautiful book about lifelong kindergarten with this spiral of creative investigations. Could you comment on these, how to actively involve students in creative investigations? Maybe if you want, like, contrast or compare some of the work that you're doing with the Mitch Resnick's work. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I totally agree with you. I mean, the more I think you can get students working on projects they care about with all the richness of that, the better. One slight divide I have with some people with whom I basically very much agree is that the problem with math is there's a quite large set of tools that you need to get some understanding of how they operate before you can use them. I mean, like if you don't know equations exist, you can't deploy equations at some level. And the question is, how do you get to the point where the student kind of knows enough to be able to run by themselves or run in a semi-structured way? So one of the things we've been trying to do with these modules is say the sort of three, Alec, I know here as sort of, his thinking is like, you know, when we think about it, there's sort of three levels, you know, you can characterize it this way. There's this very structured scaffolded thing. Go through a problem very deliberately, focus on the problem, but zoom out to the math. Hey, you know, we can talk about this thing about bike speed at this point, but actually there's a really good piece of math that's called equations. Let's go learn a little bit about equations so that we can then go back into the problem and use it. That's kind of what we need to, oh yeah, thanks, Alec. And so that's kind of the very left-hand side of these, right? The directed learning, you know, and I think you need some of that. You can't, some people think you can just set them on projects immediately and they'll go, but I don't see how to do that. I wish I did. But as soon as you can, I think you want them to then go and do projects for themselves with some scaffolding, some help, some guide rails, particularly that 4-step process. And then, of course, where you want to be is eventually you say, right, take a problem. Here's your computer. Go figure out what to do. Just work on it. So I think as much as you can step through these different things, the better. I don't know, maybe Alec has some comments more on, well, Mitch Resnick, I know more perhaps about Seymour Papat's work. Alec, do you have any comments on that comparison?
No, my main thought was currently most of the curricula that we look at, and the one that I used to teach when I was teaching, you lead with the abstraction first. Here's the abstraction, here's the plot, here's the Cartesian system. You learn how to use the Cartesian system. Whereas what we're saying is we start with the problem, and the problem is one that's going to be engaging and relevant to the student at their age, their time of life, their location. And because it's computer-based, you can adapt the problems quite quickly to react to things in the media or things that are changing as time goes on. So that motivation, the engaging of the students, is a lot more easy if you're not starting off with the abstract form.
Conrad, do you have time for 2 more questions?
I do, yeah. I mean, I'm happy to overrun a little bit. I don't want to keep people here though who.
Wonderful. Edith, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you very much for the presentation. I enjoyed it, and I'm a scientist at ETS, and so I was very interested in the slide that made the distinction between statistical AI and symbolic AI. And I had an experience a few months ago. Of course, this technology is changing all the time, but I asked an LLM to find the product of 2 large numbers, and I got the wrong answer. And so then I asked it to break it down step by step, and it showed the standard algorithm, the partial products, and then the sum of the partial products, and the partial products were incorrect, and so was the sum. And so I thought, what lesson should I take from this? And I'm very curious from your views about it. So one lesson I might take is I need to understand the algorithm at least well enough so I can troubleshoot what it's doing. Another lesson I might take from this is, you know, maybe I don't need to be so focused on the algorithm, but I need enough computational literacy so that I know what the right tool for the job is, whether it be a calculator, whether it be Wolfram Alpha, whether it be an LLM with the Wolfram Alpha plugin. And so I'm just very curious on your perspective on that.
That's a great question. I mean, you know, to broaden it a little bit, I think that is one of the key questions of our age, which is, you know, it's kind of like, what do you need to know to operate the machinery? And look, I'm much more probably on the second of your approaches than the first. I mean, I think what we really need to do is get people experience of how it works. I don't think you can really understand how it works on the inside in any great detail. You can know certain things about it. As you get more advanced, you may know more of the mechanics. But in the end, as the automation gets greater and greater and greater, and you have more and more options, you can't know all of that. And so that's not really an approach you can easily take. The other thing is, I think, by the way, that error checking, we always think is like, checking it by hand or something. That's not how it works, right? What you do is you want to try different approaches and see if they produce similar results, or if they don't, why not? So again, that's a sort of a know where the common threads are. And I always think it's interesting to think about various places as well. I mean, the obvious one that I often cite is airline pilots and how that works. Right now, they're pretty advanced in knowing how the machine works, but in the end, they don't really know what happens in computers. Sometimes that's very bad, as in the 737 MAX. But what is really advanced in airline stuff is you do a huge amount of simulation. And what it's really doing is giving you experience of all sorts of cases. And by the way, edge cases that, hopefully you won't run into most of the time. And I kind of think that's the general approach we need to do, but you need it with real. I mean, the great thing about simulation is it's so real in terms of airlines, right? It really does look like it. And that's helped tremendously in safety. And I feel like it's the same kind of approach here. And again, another analogy I often use, if you want to drive a car today, it sort of doesn't help you to know too much how to machine a piston. I mean, particularly if it's an electric car, by the way. It's sort of disjoint. Now, if you become I guess it would be for you, a NASCAR driver, a Formula One driver or something, you end up knowing more about the mechanics inside because you're closer to the edge of what the mechanic's doing. I think that's the same in mathematics. If you become a very advanced computational thinker, you may end up really having to go into the details more because you're nearer the edge. But that's not where we'd start, and it's not what we need most people to do. So yeah, it's getting experience where it goes wrong, getting used to where you get misled, seeing where the machine doesn't really work. And I think if you look at industrial revolutions, that's sort of what we've done. It seems harder this time because it's a quintessentially human thinking revolution. Yeah, and the key thing there is you can't do it unless you have real problems. You can't tell people to think about, solving quadratics by hand or billiard balls or something as a way to think about how they would model a cycling race. It's just totally disjoint. Anyway, that's my perspective. And I think this is very much a growing thing. And one of the hardest things we've been doing is try to work out what is it you need to know, right? It's not obvious at all.
Gideon,
Thank you.
will you take us home here with your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Lindsay. Thanks for your time, Conrad, and your extra time. I kind of don't want to ask this question because I might get in trouble because with myself, I've been doing math teacher education for about a generation. And, from the very beginning, I was thinking we're doing the wrong thing. And now I know we're doing the wrong thing. Do you have any idea how to apply leverage to start training, I don't know, computational literacy educators instead of training math educators?
It's a great question.
How, not the politics of getting my university to do it, but sort of the broader, how can I inject some of that into, the revisions to our very traditional math program? Any ideas?
Look, I think exposing some of the things we've been thinking about at least helps, right? I mean, in the end, I suppose my feeling about this is even if you've got to turn the handle through the standard stuff that everybody's required to do, if you have the perspective as to why you're doing it, and it helps quite a bit. I mean, one of the sad things from the TED talk that was mentioned many years ago, which I hadn't quite realized would come up, one of the sort of modally largest comments to come out was something like, this is the first guy to explain why math has anything to do with my life. Okay, so now I think knowing why math might be connected to your life does help you at least to orientate. So it doesn't solve all the problems. I think the other thing is that, having teachers somehow exposed to some things in the real world that are done with math as much as possible, bringing people from other disciplines. I mean, a crazy question, in my view, that I get asked sometimes by jurisdictions is, different countries is, you know, how much connected should our math curriculum be with like our science and the rest of our STEM curriculum? It's like, should they be very disjoint or should they be very, it's like, if you're having a mainstream math curriculum, there's presumably a reason it was supposed to be mainstream, which is because it's applicable, I hope, to a wide range of other areas. So it should be certainly applicable to science, amongst other things, but also actually to many of the rest of the bits of the curriculum too, because it's kind of like a bedrock, just like speaking your own languages, speaking English or whatever it is. And I feel the same thing here. I think we need examples. There's been a big drive in some countries to strip math out of, for example, science, because it just made it too hard and whatever. That's a disaster, right? I mean, and so I think I don't have a really good answer for you, but I think the more that we can expose upcoming teachers to this 4-step process, this way of thinking, how it actually gets applied, real ways in which it gets applied, opening their mindset, I think that will help, even if they've got to go back to teach the traditional thing. And I mean, one of the examples I give, in my book, which I find, this is not completely answering your question, but a related thing, which I find quite extraordinary. This 4-step process, or whatever similar way you want to characterize math, but let's take the 4-step process we talk about. Why don't we teach that very early to students? Why isn't that embedded? Because to me, that's the basics, right? If you're going to say, I've got, 12 candies or sweets, as we would say here, and I want to divide it between my 3 friends, right? How many does each friend get? A kind of common style of question, right? Now, obviously, you can just, the point is the division sum at some point. Why aren't we running students at that stage when they don't need it through the 4 steps, right? What's the definition of the problem? You want to fairly distribute to your friends. Well, actually, is equal fair? Might not be. It depends. Maybe some friends are more deserving than other friends. I don't know. Right. So then you're abstracting that. The abstraction step is turning that into this, into division, right? That's the abstract thing you're turning into. Then you're computing it. You're actually doing the division. Then you're interpreting it. No, is it 3 sweets or 3 candy or whatever I said for each? But if you had 11 candies, it's like, can you divide them, right? Does that work? Or do you have to give a whole one? So you've got to interpret it. That's what we ought to be going through very, very early. So then when it gets hard, they can fall back on that and they know where they are. I mean, we do this like in the military all the time, right? We say, right, we're going to get you, when you're under pressure, you need to fall back on the process. So let's learn the process before we're under pressure. And I think that would also, I think one of the main things to teach also is confidence. One of the problems is very easy to lose confidence in math and in the math classroom. So I think anything that builds confidence so that they're more able to give an open-ended lesson, I think is really beneficial. So those are a few ideas anyway. It's certainly not a solved problem, if you see what I mean.
Thanks for the effort. Those are good ideas. And let me say, calling this mainstream mathematics is, I think, a very good idea.
Interesting.
Mainstream mathematics education versus the math education that perhaps, a PhD person might need.
Right. The ancient Greek, as I put it.
Yeah, right. There's nothing wrong with that. It's
just
not what excites everybody.
Right. I mean, I being at a fancy school in the UK, I had to do some ancient Greek and I quite liked it, but I wouldn't force the world's population to do ancient Greek. And actually, it's a funny story. I was with the Greek Minister of Education not so long ago, and we had a quite amusing joke that they were even discussing this point in Greece, by the way, whether you really needed ancient Greek as a mainstream thing. Anyway, but yes, I agree with you. There's a divide there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Conrad, and thank you, Alec, for also joining and sharing your wisdom as well. We're so appreciative of you. We're just on the edge of my understanding and feeling inspired to make change within my locus of control. And I just appreciate you empowering us, this group. And it's so nice to know that that your thoughts exist and that you're moving us towards, productive outcomes in maths education. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the engagement. Appreciate it, and do continue to engage with us. Would love to be connected in different places. Thank you. That's great. And thanks very much to Lindsay to organizing everything.
Thank you. Have a great Thursday, everybody.
Thanks.